Welcome to MC Noctis, where every shadow has a story. At 3:14 in the morning, Mara Voss woke to the sound of a paintbrush moving downstairs. Her husband was asleep beside her. She knew it was Julian because one hand rested on her waist and his breath warmed the back of her neck. Then Julian's voice came through the floorboards. "Tell me how she looked before the fire." A woman answered from the locked studio. She answered in Mara's voice. The brush began moving again. The man in bed opened his eyes. He did not ask who was downstairs. He whispered, "Don't let her finish my mouth." 11 nights later, 2 women would arrive at Julian's final campaign fundraiser, claiming to be his wife. One carried Mara's scars. The other carried Mara's face. Every guest in the room would choose the beautiful one. But that was not the moment Mara understood what had entered her house. She understood earlier when she looked through the studio window and saw a graceful stranger remove her expression, spread it across a wooden frame, and begin painting someone else underneath. She understood when Julian returned from a speech with the small scar beside his mouth missing. She understood when a portrait of her husband developed a heartbeat. What Mara did not understand was why the thing needed permission. It never forced open a door. It waited to be invited. It never stole a name. It waited for someone ashamed of that name to surrender it. And it never chose the faces it wore. People chose for it. So tonight, before you look into a dark mirror, ask yourself a simple question. If the person you loved could become kinder, younger, more beautiful, and easier to forgive, how much could their face change before you stopped calling them by the same name? Mara Voss rebuilt faces for people who could no longer speak for themselves. The Massachusetts State Police sent her photographs of unidentified remains, measurements from damaged skulls, and boxes marked with case numbers. Mara gave each stranger a mouth, a brow, the suggestion of a life. Sometimes a family called months later to say they had recognized someone. She trusted bone more than memory. Bone did not flatter. Her husband made his living from the opposite skill. Julian Voss was running for state senate. He could enter a union hall full of angry strangers and leave with everyone believing he had listened to them personally. His campaign slogan was, "Honest enough to be seen." The slogan had been Mara's idea. 8 years earlier, a kitchen fire had tightened the skin from her left cheek to her jaw. Julian told reporters he had carried her from the house. The story made him look devoted, so Mara never corrected it. In truth, he had frozen in the doorway. Mara had crawled out alone. That was the first Voss face they painted together. By autumn, Julian's campaign manager, Tess Harrow, had begun cropping Mara from event photographs. Focus groups found her scar difficult. Tess never used that word in front of Mara. She called it visual noise. Julian objected just enough to remain a good husband. Then he asked Mara to miss the final debate. "Only this one," he said. "After we win, none of this matters." Mara heard the part he did not say. "After we win, you may become visible again." The stranger arrived that night in the rain. Julian found her, walking barefoot beside the county road, dressed in ivory beneath his overcoat.
She said a man had followed her from the bus station. Her name was Celia Reed, and she needed shelter until morning. Celia was an adult woman with a face so balanced it seemed unfinished. Nothing about it caught the eye, yet Mara found herself staring. Then Celia smiled. It was Mara's smile from before the fire. Not similar, the same slight lift on the right side, the one Julian used to imitate when they were newly married. Celia looked at Mara's scar. "Some faces remember being loved," she said. Julian's hand tightened around the wet coat. Mara should have closed the door. Instead, Julian said the roads were flooding and the shelters were full. Mara heard herself answer, "She can stay one night." Celia stepped across the threshold. From the detached portrait studio behind the house came a single, delicate knock.
As if something inside had been waiting for permission to begin. Celia did not sleep in the guest room. Mara checked at midnight and found the bed untouched. The ivory dress hung over a chair, still dripping, while bare footprints crossed the floor and ended at the mirror. There were no prints leading away. In the glass, Celia stood behind Mara. Mara turned. The room was empty. When she faced the mirror again, Celia's reflection was practicing expressions. Julian's campaign smile, Tess's patient contempt, Mara's face on the morning of her wedding. The reflected woman raised one finger to her lips. Then the mirror showed only Mara. At breakfast, Celia sat beside Julian wearing the same ivory dress, now perfectly dry. She asked how he had proposed, what song Mara chose for the reception, and whether he had ever wished a single night could be repainted. Julian answered too quickly. Whenever he supplied a detail, Celia tried it on. She tilted her head like Mara. She touched Julian's wrist the way Mara once had. She laughed with a sound that belonged to neither of them. Mara asked when Celia planned to leave. Julian said the storm had washed out the south bridge. Celia said nothing. Her reflection in the dark window mouthed, "Not yet." That afternoon, Mara discovered Julian's campaign photographs spread across the studio floor. Every image of her had been cut around the face. On the central table lay a damaged painting, an empty chair beneath a hanging white shape, its surface cracked with age. The brass label read, "Painted Guest." Julian entered before Mara could examine it. He said he had borrowed the piece from a private collector as a surprise. A restorer claimed its materials came from an old tradition of ceremonial portraiture. The same technique, he said, might help improve Mara's scar without surgery. "You brought a stranger into our house to fix my face." "I brought a specialist." "Does she know you call her Celia?" Julian's expression failed for a moment. Behind him, Celia stood in the doorway. She placed a hand over her smooth mouth. When she lowered it, the lips had changed. They were Mara's. "He did not ask me to repair you," she said. Julian ordered her to stop. Celia smiled wider. "He asked me to return the wife people envied." Mara looked at her husband. His shame arrived before his denial. That night, Julian slept with one hand on Mara's waist, as if touch could prove loyalty. At 3:14, a brush began moving downstairs. Julian's voice came through the floorboards. "Tell me how she looked before the fire." Celia answered in Mara's voice. The man beside Mara opened his eyes. "Don't let her finish my mouth," he whispered. Then his lips curved into a smile he had not chosen. By morning, Julian claimed not to remember speaking. He accused Mara of confusing a nightmare with the truth. Celia had gone, he said. The washed-out bridge was open, the guest room was empty, and there was no reason to damage his campaign over a superstition. He sounded afraid. Mara almost believed him. Then she noticed a line of dark pigment beneath his fingernails. That evening, Julian left for a donor dinner. Mara waited until his car disappeared, then crossed the yard with a flashlight. The studio door was locked from inside. Wet brushstrokes moved beyond it. Mara climbed onto an old rain barrel and looked through the high window. Celia stood before the work table, with her back exposed to the cold room. She lifted both hands to her jaw and slowly drew her beautiful expression away. It came loose like damp paper. Beneath it was not another woman.
A tall, grey shape crouched over the table, unfinished and narrow, with shallow hollows where features should have been. It had no eyes, yet it turned toward every portrait as though listening to them breathe. It stretched Celia's expression across a wooden frame. Beside it hung another pale mask. Mara recognized her own face before the first brush touched it. The thing painted from Julian's photographs. It added the freckles he remembered. It softened the jaw he had stopped touching. It erased the fire. While Mara watched, the unfinished mouth began whispering her wedding vows. Not the words she had spoken, the cleaner version Julian repeated in interviews. The rain barrel shifted beneath her. The creature looked at the window. Every unfinished portrait in the studio turned with it. Mara fell backward into the mud. Inside, the bolt slid open. Celia stepped into the rain wearing her lovely face again. Water struck her cheeks, but did not cling to them. "He thinks beauty will return what he lost," she said. "What did he give you?" "A face he said he no longer needed." Celia glanced toward the road. Julian's car was approaching. "But people rarely understand which face they have offered." Mara ran into the house and locked the kitchen door. Julian was already standing inside. His car had not reached the driveway. He wore the suit from the donor dinner. His hair was dry. The old white scar beside his mouth had vanished. "You went into the studio," he said. Mara stared at him. The real Julian always touched his wedding ring when he lied. This man touched it because he saw her looking. "Who am I?" she asked. His answer came too perfectly. "The woman I have always loved." Behind him, the black kitchen window reflected a faceless thing wearing Julian's suit. Mara did not call him Julian. She told him she was tired, let him kiss the unscarred side of her face, and waited until he entered the shower. Then she drove. The business card hidden beneath the painted guest label led her to Dr. Naomi Shen at the Bellwether Museum in Boston. Mara reached the museum after closing, but the conservator answered on the fifth call. When Mara described the empty chair, Dr. Shen stopped asking questions. The painting had vanished from secured storage 6 months earlier. Its last 3 owners had reported a guest arriving in bad weather, followed by relatives whose appearances improved while their private memories decayed. Dr. Shen refused to call it a ghost. "A ghost remembers its own face," she said. "This thing has never had one."
It could copy photographs, voices, gestures, even facts. What it could not create was recognition. For that, it needed someone who knew the original to keep answering. "Do not correct it," Dr. Shen warned. "Do not remind it. Do not use the name it wants." "How do I get my husband back?" The line went quiet. "Find where it stored the part photographs cannot hold." Mara returned before dawn. The man in Julian's body was rehearsing a speech in the library. He greeted her with relief and asked where she had been. She gave him a false memory. "I drove to the Blue Hotel where we spent our first anniversary." There had been no Blue Hotel. His expression softened. "You wore the green dress." The creature had learned how a loving husband should respond. It had not learned the truth. Mara entered the studio while it left for a morning interview. Behind a stack of campaign posters, she found a new portrait of Julian, seated in an empty room. His painted eyes were closed. Mara placed her hand against the canvas. A heartbeat struck her palm. The eyes opened. Julian pressed both hands against the painted surface from the other side. His mouth formed slowly, as though each word had to swim through oil. Don't say my name near it. Mara nearly cried out. He told her the stranger had offered to restore what the fire took. Julian thought the phrase, "any face you no longer need," meant his image as a loyal husband, the campaign story, the pity, the photographs. Instead, it had taken the face that belonged to everyone. Now the public version of Julian walked freely, while everything private remained trapped in the portrait. Why did you agree? His painted gaze moved toward the unfinished mask of Mara. He could not answer. The studio door opened. Tess Harrow stood there holding Mara's phone. "Because the old photographs tested 12 points better," she said. Then she locked Mara inside with her husband's beating portrait. Tess had managed Julian's career since his first city council race. She had written his apologies, selected his grief, and taught him where to place his hand on Mara's back when cameras appeared. She knew the kitchen fire story was false. She had also known about the painted guest for 3 weeks. "At first, I thought Julian had joined a cult," she said through the locked door. "Then he came out of this room able to remember every donor and never become tired." The replacement had raised 9 points in 2 days. Tess no longer cared what it was. The final fundraiser would take place at the farmhouse the following evening. Julian planned to introduce his restored wife before a live audience. The transformation would be presented as a private, reconstructive treatment. Mara looked at the blank face hanging from the frame. "That thing is not me." "Voters have never met you," Tess replied. "They have met photographs and a story." Her footsteps receded. Inside the portrait, Julian began to weep. Mara searched the studio until she found a recorder wrapped in old canvas. Julian's voice filled the room. In the first recording, he asked the unseen restorer to remove Mara's scar. In the second, he asked whether the new face could be younger. In the third, he said he wanted his wife to look at him without remembering the doorway where he had failed to save her. That was the truth beneath the vanity. Every time Julian saw Mara's scar, he saw himself frozen in the burning kitchen. He had not wanted to heal her. He had wanted to erase the witness. The final recording was quieter. "I don't know if I love her," Julian admitted, "or if I love being the man everyone praises for staying." An answer came in Celia's voice. "Those are the same face if no one looks underneath." Mara switched off the recorder. Julian pressed against the canvas. "I was afraid you would leave after the election. So you decided to replace me before I could. I thought it would still be you. You thought the part that looked right would be enough." His heartbeat slowed. The painted room around him had begun to darken. Each time the thing outside used his name, another detail disappeared. The lines beside his eyes, the dent in his chin, the expression Mara remembered from nights when no one was watching. The public face was consuming the private man. Mara found a jar of conservation solvent and loosened the hinges with a palette knife. Before she could remove the final pin, the mirror behind her brightened. Celia stood inside it, holding Mara's finished face. "He can still come back," she said. "You said the same thing to him. He wanted a better wife. You want a better husband." The glass rippled. Celia pushed the face through as if the mirror were water. It landed in Mara's hands, warm and impossibly soft. "Wear it," Celia whispered. "Then ask whether you care what is underneath." Mara should have dropped the face. Instead, she held it against her scar. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the studio disappeared. Mara stood beneath summer light on the courthouse steps. Julian looked at her the way he had before the fire. No one glanced away from her cheek. No reporter praised her courage. No stranger treated survival like a deformity she was required to explain. she felt beautiful. Worse, she felt forgiven. The face tightened. Something thin entered the corner of her mouth and searched behind her teeth. Mara tore the mask away. The courthouse vanished. She fell against the work table, choking on the taste of old paint. The face in her hands had changed. Its eyes now moved exactly like hers. It smiled. "Thank you," it said in Mara's voice. Celia stepped out of the mirror. She no longer needed to ask intimate questions. That single moment of longing had given her Mara's breath, posture, and shame. The studio door opened. The thing wearing Julian entered with Tess. Mara tried to reach the portrait, but Julian's replacement caught her wrist. Up close, his features were almost flawless. Only his eyes remained empty when no one else was present. "Stand beside me tomorrow," it said. "Tell them I am your husband, and he can stop suffering." The Julian inside the painting begged Mara to agree. The creature's smile deepened. "You hear how quickly love becomes permission?" Mara refused. Tess struck her across the temple with the heavy recorder. When Mara woke, the studio was dark and the finished face was gone. A monitor on the floor showed the library inside the farmhouse. Campaign workers arranged flowers, cameras tested their lights. The fundraiser had begun. On screen, Julian entered to applause. An adult woman walked beside him, wearing an ivory dress. She turned toward the camera. Mara saw herself before the fire. The second, Mara touched Julian's arm with perfect familiarity. She laughed at a private joke. She spoke about recovery, marriage, and the courage to begin again. The audience loved her within minutes. The real Mara pounded on the locked door. No one heard. Behind her, the portrait whispered, "She knows the vows. Only the public ones. That may be all they need." The second Mara looked directly into the camera. Although the monitor had no microphone, her voice came from behind Mara's shoulder. "You can rest now." Every unfinished portrait opened its eyes. They began repeating comments from campaign focus groups. Too severe, too damaged, too difficult to look at. Mara covered her ears. Julian's portrait said her name. The other paintings repeated it. Each repetition made the second Mara on screen more convincing. Mara took the palette knife and drove it through the monitor. The screen died. The woman's scarless reflection remained in the black glass. It lifted one finger to its lips. Then it pointed toward the portrait's hidden heartbeat. Mara tore the back from Julian's portrait. Behind the canvas was a darkness deeper than the frame. At its center, a small red heart hung inside a cage of painted threads. Each beat pulled another detail from Julian's face. Mara did not cut it. Not yet. She carried the portrait to the high window, shattered the glass with a stool, and lowered the frame into the mud before climbing out. The fundraiser filled the house with warm light and applause. Mara entered through the kitchen carrying her husband against her chest. They saw the scar, the wet hair, the mud, and the portrait. Their expressions arranged her into the role Tess had prepared: unstable, jealous, dangerous. On the library platform, the second Mara stood beside Julian. She was radiant. She wore the face from wedding photographs and the smile focus groups preferred. When she saw the real Mara, fear appeared in exactly the way a sympathetic wife should display it. "That woman broke into our home," she said. Security moved forward. Mara raised the portrait. "Ask her about the fire." The room hesitated. The second Mara took Julian's hand. "My husband carried me out." That was the story in every newspaper profile. Mara looked at the painted Julian. For 8 years, she had protected his lie. Exposing it now would destroy the last human memory people had of him. "Tell them," she said. The portrait's mouth opened. Julian's voice came through the canvas, faint but unmistakable. I froze in the doorway. The crowd fell silent. Mara crawled through the kitchen alone. "I told the first reporter I carried her. She let me keep saying it." The second, Mara's smile trembled. A thin line appeared beside her mouth. Julian's replacement stepped between her and the audience. Tess shouted that the voice was a recording. Mara turned the open back of the portrait toward the cameras. The heart beat inside the impossible depth. Some guests screamed. Others lifted their phones. One man said it was a campaign stunt. Another said Mara had built the object herself. The room divided between those willing to lose Julian and those who still needed him to win. The false Julian began a speech. He spoke about persecution, loyalty, and a sick woman's attempt to punish the family that loved her. With every familiar phrase, his face grew firmer. The crowd started applauding. The second Mara recovered with him. Recognition moved across her features like fresh paint. Mara understood that proof would never be enough while the lie remained useful. She reached into the portrait. Painted threads closed around her wrist. The real Julian screamed. "Wait, I can change!" His replacement smiled at the audience. "You have already heard that promise," it whispered through Julian's painted mouth. The two voices had become connected. Saving the original would preserve the thing wearing him. Destroying the mask would destroy what remained of the man. Julian begged Mara to call him her husband one last time. She almost did. Then she remembered the doorway, the campaign photographs, and the face he had ordered for her without asking whether she wanted to be changed. "I loved you," Mara said. The words were not forgiveness. They were a goodbye. She poured conservation solvent into the frame. The painted threads dissolved. For 1 second, Julian appeared as he had before ambition taught him how to pose. Frightened, ordinary, and truly sorry. Then the heart stopped. Every light in the house exploded. The second Mara folded to the floor. Her borrowed face loosened and slid into Tess's hands. The thing wearing Julian staggered, losing all the expressions only Mara had known. The private husband vanished. What remained was the candidate. The crowd still knew that face. Flames climbed a curtain where a hot campaign lamp had fallen. Smoke entered the library. Guests rushed for the doors. Tess stared at the empty mask in her hands. Without Julian, her career, debts, and 10 years of work would disappear. Mara watched calculation defeat terror in her eyes. "What must I give?" Tess asked. Celia's voice answered from every mirror. "A face no one came here to see." Tess looked once at her own reflection. Then she pressed Mara's beautiful face over it. The mask tightened. When she opened her eyes, the second Mara was standing again. She smiled at the cameras and took Julian's hand. Together, the perfect couple walked out through the smoke. The real Mara remained beside the dead portrait, or the house burned around her. Mara escaped through the broken studio window. By sunrise, the farmhouse was a black frame against the rain. Fire crews found no body belonging to Julian Voss, Tess Harrow, or the woman in the ivory dress. That did not trouble the official account. Julian and his wife had survived an attack by a distressed former forensic artist. Tess was listed as missing. The campaign released footage of the scarless Mara coughing in Julian's arms outside the house. The real Mara appeared in the background of the same footage. Whenever she pointed this out, people saw a confused stranger. Dr. Shen believed her. She also admitted that belief was part of the problem. The painted guest no longer needed its original canvas. It had passed into photographs, broadcasts, and every person who had chosen the easier face.
Mara submitted fingerprints, dental records, and samples to prove her identity. The results were delayed, then misplaced, then sealed by a judge after Julian's attorneys argued that releasing them could endanger his recovering wife. Sympathy carried him through the election. 3 months later, Senator-elect Julian Voss stood before the State House with Mara's old face smiling beside him. The woman wore Tess's posture. No one seemed to notice. She told reporters that the fire had inspired her to undergo a private reconstructive procedure. She said trauma had taught her how dangerous resentment could become. On television, the false Mara repeated the wedding vows Celia had learned. Thousands of viewers praised her courage. The real Mara watched from a rented room under her maiden name. Her phone's photo application identified the woman on screen as Mara Voss. It labeled Mara's own reflection, unknown. That evening, a white hat box appeared outside her door. Inside lay Tess Harrow's face. The eyes opened. "I thought I could take it off after the election," it whispered. The face began to change. Tess's cheekbones softened. Her mouth became Mara's. A pale line formed from the left cheek to the jaw. The creature was no longer painting beauty. It was practicing accuracy. On television, Julian thanked his wife for standing beside him. The woman wearing Mara's younger face turned toward the camera. For an instant, she looked directly into the rented room. "There you are," she said. The broadcast continued as if the words had belonged to the speech. Mara covered the hat box, but Tessa's voice kept speaking beneath the lid. "They do not need you dead. They only need you seen less often than she is." Every scream in the building carried the same flawless couple. In hundreds of apartments, strangers learned Mara's new face. The mirror above the sink changed slowly. First, Mara's scar disappeared from the reflection. Then her eyes became younger. Finally, the woman in the glass smiled with Tessa's patience and Celia's perfect mouth. Mara did not move. Her reflection lifted one finger to its lips. The thing had learned something Julian never understood. Beauty was optional. Truth was optional. A mask did not have to replace the person beneath it. It only needed more witnesses. What frightened you more? The faceless creature, or the people who kept repainting it because the lie was more useful than Mara? Tell me in the comments whether Julian was taken by Hua Bi or whether he surrendered himself the moment he decided his wife's real face was no longer good enough. Thank you for listening to MC Noctis. If this story stayed with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who understands that recognition is not always the same as truth. Until our next story, be careful which version of the people you love you choose to believe. Some masks hide monsters. Others become monsters because too many people refuse to look away.